the responsible management, and the challenges of the 21st century. If our anniversary, our 100th anniversary, would have taken place 10 years earlier, we probably would not have chosen corporate responsibility as our topic. Obviously, some profound changes took place in the last decade, changes that moved this topic center stage, both in the companies and in the education of future managers at business schools. The speed of change which our society is experiencing at the moment is probably unprecedented in recent history. And the world in which our students, many of them in the room, will start their career will be very different from the world in which their parent generation had or still have their career. The solutions we learned and the problems we are facing do no longer fit. The world of Europe and the US after the Second World War saw the rise of the modern industrial society. And this society is characterized by a clear division of labor between what corporations do and what governments do. And probably the most influential theoretical voice in this debate on the role of corporations in society has been, since the early 1960s, Milton Friedman, who clearly stated that the only social responsibility of a company is to increase profits and nothing else. Nothing else in brackets, as long as they comply with the law. So the law is the limit of corporate activities. And the business of business is business. This idea of shareholder value maximization has not only shaped management education in the 20th century, it also shaped the way managers in corporations perceived or still perceive the world. The world of Milton Friedman, 1960s, 1970s, is a world that is neatly organized in nation states. And these nation states that he has in mind have democratic, liberal democratic governments that create efficient, more or less efficient regulatory frameworks around the corporations. And these regulations tame and frame what companies do. They tame the homo economicus. So this theory describes business activities, for example, between Switzerland and the US, between France and Germany, between the UK and Italy. At the beginning of the 21st century, we realized that this world, this nation-state world, is eroding, and that globalization of business activities have at least two consequences for the relation between governments and business. First, the nation-state becomes less and less relevant for the organization of economic activities. And second, governments do not necessarily correspond to the model of Western liberal democracies. Metaphorically spoken, globalization starts in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, because this is the starting point for the organization of globally networked supply chains. Among the first movers in this game were Nike and Levi's, outsourcing production activities to Indonesia and South Korea. And since then, the dominating model of the corporation is the multinational corporation. Companies like Walmart are organized in networks with more than 70,000 direct suppliers, and Walmart does more business with China than UK or Russia. And the multinational corporation is able to deconstruct its value chain in a way that it can shift the different parts to the most advantageous places in the world. It takes a supplier of Nike 2 weeks to put together all the machines and to go from China to Vietnam if the wages increase too much in China. This kind of new speed that we see in economic activities have some consequences for the relation between business and society. Let me mention two of them. The first one is that this process is damaging the balance between the regulator, governments, and the private actors, the corporations, because corporations can flee from regulation and can go somewhere else, while governments cannot leave their contexts. And second, as I said, Friedman assumes that business activities take place between more or less democratic countries. The geopolitical context around multinational corporations is quite different from that. You have, for instance, conflict zones. And in these conflict zones, multinational corporations dig for resources or buy resources, like coltan from Congo. 80% of the coltan is coming from Congo, and it is necessary to build computers and iPhones and other electronic devices. And there is no government at all in Congo, and this coltan is digged by slave children. And we are all connected to this through global supply chains. Second, there are weak governance zones, countries that might have regulatory frameworks that look like more or less acceptable, but the governments are either not able or not willing to enforce them, countries like Bangladesh, for instance. And many multinational corporations have their production activities in this kind of context. And finally, there are repressive regimes like Myanmar or Iran, where there is a strong government, but the government itself is the violator of human rights, and following the law in such a context makes no sense. So we have various contexts in which the old idea that Milton Friedman took for granted, that companies should maximize profits as long as they comply with the law, makes no sense any longer. There is no global government, there is no private international law, there is no global police, there is only global corporations. And the recent financial crisis, in my view, is just another example of this lack of regulation around globalized business activities. Since the beginning of this outsourcing wave in the early 1990s, corporations are increasingly under pressure for the harm that happens along their operations. Social harm, environmental harm, and their connections to the repressive regimes under which they operate. We have observed an explosion of NGO activism around the world, and many of these NGOs targeting corporations and no longer governments. And they make the harm that happens along those global production networks transparent. So why do we talk about corporate responsibility and sustainability so much in recent years? Because of this power shift between private and public actors and the rising tide of critique from civil society vis-à-vis the activities of companies. The license to operate is challenged. So this is the dark side of the force. But there's also, as in the original film, a good side of the force. And two events to conclude might illustrate this. In 1996, when the sport goods industry was shaken by another child labor scandal, Bill Clinton, the then president of the US, invited the companies of the industry to find a solution to the problem, arguing that he, as the US president, cannot solve the problem, but the companies can. And as a result of this initiative, emerged the Fair Labor Association in Geneva, which is one of the most relevant private regulation schemes in the world. So companies become regulators themselves, where governments are no longer able and willing to play that role. And the second event happened in 1999 at the World Economic Forum, when Kofi Annan asked the business leaders to create a global compact in order to give, I cite, a human face to the global market. And since then, thousands of companies have subscribed to the 10 principles of the global compact, thereby accepting, whether they perform well or not is a different question, but accepting at least a much broader role for themselves in society than they were ready to accept before. At both these phenomena, the growing corporate involvement in harm doing along production activities and the engagement of corporations to defend human rights, to promote them, or the environmental standards, blurs the border between business and governments. And this border that was taken for granted in the 20th century can no longer be the same today. The multinational corporation is no longer a private actor. It has become a public and political actor. So what is the role of business in society under the condition of an emerging global world order? And what are the consequences for universities when it comes to educating future leaders in this new context? We have invited some of the most eminent experts to give some answers to these questions, and I look forward to the debate, and I hand over to Delia.
So I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Economist group. Just as we were standing outside, Guido told me that he uses a very classic special report that we did in The Economist back in 2004 as an example of the Milton Friedman old-style company approach to CSR, to corporate social responsibility. And I was wondering why then he'd invited us to moderate this debate. But actually, one of the interesting things in The Economist to see is that when the editor who was responsible for that report left, the editor-in-chief, we decided to do another report shortly afterwards, repositioning The Economist. You may have missed that one in 2008, and people wondered why we did so many reports on this so close to each other. But it's very interesting that the Economist also has taken a very much more proactive view towards the whole issue of corporate responsibility, and you can see that if you look at articles coming up, you can see that changing very much. So thank you for inviting me despite or because of our changes and ways, but I think one of the things that we always try to avoid is things that are full of rhetoric and hot air, blah, blah. And so when I looked at the title for this one, I thought for a while about whether this was going to be a debate that was of that category, of the everybody agreeing with each other and saying the same sort of warm and woolly things. But when I talked to all of the people on this panel before the session over the last few weeks, I realized that there are actually some very interesting, very unique views, and I think we're going to have a very insightful and robust discussion around the issues. And I will please any of you who want to join in the discussion once I've introduced everybody and we have started the debate, I will turn to you, so please don't be shy. There are microphones that can come around the room. I would welcome questions from you. Please do ask questions rather than making long comments, and I will remind you if you start to make long comments that I'm waiting for your questions, so don't be offended. But we are here to hear the panel answering those questions. But please do join in and don't be shy to get involved. Let me just introduce all my panelists here and give you a very, very brief view of where they're coming from so you can understand their perspectives. Let's make sure I get this in the right order. You've changed the order on me from my list, but here we go. On my immediate left, Professor Klaus Schwab, who probably needs no introduction, the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, which brings together business and policy leaders with a very explicit aim of improving the state of the world, and therefore obviously has always been a key player in this. I was just asking him if that was the aim when he first began this in 1971, and very interestingly it was, so we will hear about that. Next to him is Laura Tyson, who is Professor of Global Management at the Haas School of Business in California, economic advisor to Presidents Clinton and Obama. She was on the Economic Recovery Advisory Board recently, and right now is on the Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which has the task of encouraging the private sector to hire and invest in American competitiveness, so also very interesting in terms of the globalization debate we were just discussing. Next to Laura is Pierre Landolt, who is chairman of the Sandoz Family Foundation, director of Syngenta, and a large-scale organic farmer in Brazil. That's about as simple as I can make it. He does everything. Maybe we'll understand a little bit more as it goes on, but he straddles every kind of divide you can think of. He is on all sides of the question, and therefore has some very, very interesting perspectives from different views. Next to him, Susan George, who is president of the board of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, which coordinates scholars who are involved very actively in contributing to social justice. And she is the honorary president of HEC in France. She has just written a book, and I will use your original title because I think it's one that states the purpose very well, that is called Their Crises, Our Solutions, and has a very interesting perspective on the role of elites in solving problems. I'll leave you to say more about that one. Next to her, Darrel Duffie, the Dean Witter Distinguished Professor of Finance at the Graduate School of Business of Stanford University. He is the representative of finance here. I'm sorry, Darrel, that's the role you have to play. He's a member of the Financial Advisory Roundtable of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and among other things, director at Moody's. So you've got a lot to answer for. We'll be looking forward to your comments, yes. Bring it on, good, right. And at the end, we have Paola Ghillani, who is the founder of Paola, Ghillani and Friends, which is, again, difficult to explain, an advisory firm that is helping companies develop sustainable, ethical, and profitable business models. If you disagree with that, you can explain yourself later on. Paola started her career in the pharmaceutical industry, and indeed in the marketing department, and has some interesting perspectives from there, before becoming head of the Max Havelaar Foundation and then later chairwoman of Fairtrade International. She's also on the board of several companies and working with them to develop sustainable business models, so also quite actively engaged in the business sector. So the three areas that I think that we should be looking at, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people disagreeing with me here, so we'll just start off with these questions. The first one, what exactly should companies be responsible for? So when we're talking about corporate responsibility, are we talking about doing no harm? Are we talking about doing good? Are we assuming that business is working for the common good or for profits? So what are they responsible for? The second area of questions that I would like to look at is how corporate responsibility impacts business. Can a profit-oriented company really be expected to take responsibility seriously? That's the question. And the third one is, if we accept that companies have much broader responsibilities, who is responsible for ensuring that they play a more responsible role? Who does that? Is that the shareholders? Is it independent auditors? Is it governments? Is it regulators? NGOs? The public at large? How do we, if we get to a consensus, so how do we develop a consensus, and how do we then actually enforce it and ensure that it happens?
I feel we should first ask the question, what is the purpose of business? What is the type of economy we are living in? And I would like to start with a controversial statement, particularly looking at the theme challenges of the 21st century. I think in the 21st century, capitalism is dead. Now let me explain. If we think of capitalism in terms of a philosophy centered around the production apparatus, we have a wrong approach. I was recently, I'm speaking very seldom, and you never have heard me, I think it's an exception to be here, but I had another exception addressing, since we have our own master's program, addressing the deans of business schools. And asked the deans of business schools, you teach management. What is the philosophy behind? What is the purpose of business? And I have to say, there were 180. It took about 3 minutes, maybe a little bit shorter, until finally someone raised their hand and referred to the recent article of my friend, Michael Porter, where he says the role of business is to create shared value. But this is a slogan for me. It's a good article. Now let me go back what I believe the role of business is, and it gives a number of answers to the questions which were raised by Professor Palazzo and which you raised later. For me, business has to be based on the stakeholder concept. And that was the reason why I created the World Economic Forum in 1971. Because I wrote a book in 1970 where I described the stakeholder concept, which means that business does not serve only shareholders, but business should serve all those who have a stake in the business, who depend on the decisions which management is making. Now, what does it mean, really? Of course, I'm not so naive not to see the contradictions. And you have short-term contradictions in the stakeholder concept. If you look, stakeholders versus employees, you make profit. Do you pay out the profit in terms of dividends or in terms of salary increases? This is a conflict. But at the end, all stakeholders have one common interest. And the common interest is the long-term vitality and prosperity of the company. Now, what has happened? And the management should be the trustee of all stakeholders to make this objective happen. Now what happened in the crisis is that the system was perverted, because with incentives and with bonuses, the management, instead of acting as a trustee of all stakeholders, became solely associated with the interests of the shareholders. So you had a kind of perversion of the system. And I would say also a kind of deprofessionalization of management. Management, as I said, became associated with the shareholders. And I would like to ask the question, why do we expect from the profession of managers that they would do a good job only if they are profiting via bonuses or other incentives? I have to tell you a story. 7 years ago, I had to undergo unexpectedly a major operation. And of course, what I did, I tried to choose the best surgeon. Now, if this person would have acted like some managers do and would have told me, I charge you $10,000 for the operation, it was in the States, but since you depend on the quality of my professionalism, I charge you also 5% of your future income. Would we have accepted it? Certainly no. So the question is, why do we look at managers as a special category of people? Of course, if they are owners and if they are, then they are sharing the risks. Why do we look, why wouldn't we accept from a doctor to tell us, I want to be financially remunerated for the success of my operation? But we accept now from a manager that he will perform only best if he makes a very special income. Now, this is my concept of stakeholder, and I can tell you, this is consistent. The reason why to create the World Economic Forum was to create a platform for stakeholders to meet. And since the beginning, all stakeholders were present. I just think of, I checked it today, 73, for example, Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader was not a friend of business at that time. Or I take, what is his first name? If we go to the Swiss Romand, Mr. Weber, etc. Now, coming to your other issues to define better corporate social responsibility, particularly in terms of globalization. By the way, I just want to make one remark. In '87, because Professor Palazzo mentioned it, I created the term in an editorial in IHT that we have to create globalism with a human face. Now, coming back to the social responsibility, what has happened with globalization is that companies have not only to respond to the demands of their own stakeholders, but they have become stakeholders themselves in the global system. So you have a double stakeholder theory on a micro level, where the company has to serve its stakeholders, but companies today in a free global room have to consider, if they want to have the license to operate in the room, have to consider also their responsibilities. And I call it global corporate citizenship. So we have different levels of social responsibility. We have corporate, I defined five levels of corporate engagement in society in an article in Foreign Affairs 2 years ago. You have corporate governance, which means, of course, you observe the laws. And here, certainly the legal department and legal authorities are responsible for surveillance. You have second, corporate charity, which, let's say, the tsunami happens and so on. I think like everybody, you give money. You have corporate social responsibility, which means that you act in a socially acceptable manner towards your stakeholders. But you have in the global age, you have two new dimensions. One is social entrepreneurship, and it can be an individual, but it has to be also a corporation, which means you use your resources, which you have, your capabilities, not just your money, to do good. I give you an example. When the earthquake in Haiti happened last year, some people met and were looking what to do. And one of the ideas which came out was of Coca-Cola to produce in a time frame of 8 weeks mango juice, whereby the mangoes were collected from farmers in Haiti and to distribute them through their own system. Or microcredits is, for example, also a social entrepreneurship dimension. But then you have the top dimension, which is global corporate citizenship, best executed in partnership with governments and civil society, which means today no global issue can be solved by governments alone, by business alone, or by civil society alone. You need partnerships, and a corporation which has a license to operate globally has to be interested, for example, in AIDS in Africa, and has to work together with governments and civil society to address those global issues. So maybe a long answer, but I had to provide some kind of a framework.
When we were talking, you were asking questions that go beyond these sort of levels of responsibility to look at whether companies can be responsible when they're producing certain products and in the ways in which they are dealing. Can you explain a little bit more about what you see as responsibility for companies?
I have practiced myself responsible management, and everything starts with the product and the service that you are putting on the market. In reality, everything has a life cycle, and nowadays in our capitalistic, financial, global world, we go for profit maximization in the short term to any price, but we know very clearly that human beings are not working so, they are not functioning so, and the nature is not functioning so. So we are coming to tensions, and these tensions create crisis. And if I'm coming back to the origin of the word crisis, it's coming from the Greek, and it means making choices. Making choices. Crisis means making choices. And we can choose with our consciousness as manager, as consumer, as investor. Any people can make choices with their own consciousness. And I like very much what Confucius was, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit philosophical, but I'm very liking what Confucius said. He said that the good and the bad is not existing. What is existing is simply the human behavior and the inhuman or not human behavior. And I'm sure any manager, any people working, any consumer is not waking up in the morning saying, today I'm going to be not human or inhuman. It's not like this. However, we can choose where we want to move the cursor each time we take daily decision. For instance, by innovating a new product. And we can move the cursor more in the more human way. However, it's very difficult because we are human beings, and as you know, we have this free will that is differentiating us from animals. Our free will is differentiating us from animals, and we can choose. And the temptation is very big that we choose the 7 capital sins. I don't want to speak about DSK today, but let's speak about avidity, cupidity, and other things. Avidity, cupidity, we had a big financial crisis because of this cupidity. So what I want to say with that is that simply each person can choose another way of doing business and not business as usual. And the other way is maybe to optimize profit in an economical way, in a societal way, and also in an ecological way. And companies can really do that. It's so easy. You just need to integrate strategic objective in your strategic planning and in your management. You just need to integrate this kind of sustainable economic objective, social objectives, and environmental objective in the sense of industrial ecology. Now, maybe you have heard I mention sustainable economical objectives. Everybody believes that every company is putting to themselves sustainable economical objectives, but this is not the truth. I give you an example. AIG, not in Switzerland. I could take many in Switzerland as well, but I'm taking AIG, the big insurer in the USA. AIG, before the financial crisis in 2008, you know better than me, was quoted at the Sustainability Dow Jones Index. This means they were very good, if not best in class, in all the social and environmental aspects. However, they had set themselves unrealistic, in my view, financial and economical objectives, especially with their sector of investment, AIG investment, based in Delaware in the USA. It's a kind of paradise there. And they forgot completely to put to themselves just the sustainable economical objectives. And it starts with that, because if you are creating a company, it's clear you want to create it, you want to make a good business, you want to earn also money. But the biggest purpose in the beginning is always the pioneer of a company. The entrepreneur is going to start a business because the purpose is more a purpose that is living in himself, and he wants to create a value for the society. It starts very often like this. There are few companies that have just been created just to, from the beginning, maximize the profit in the short term at any prices.
If you look at responsibilities in the sense of dividing between doing no harm or doing good, we heard from Professor Schwab that he sees different levels and a spectrum. Is that how you see it, or where do you see the main responsibilities when you're looking at building it into the core of the...
There are companies that they don't care about corporate responsibility, they don't care about sustainable development. And some companies are doing it for the image, and usually you can recognize them very quickly. This one, they have in fact usually a staff position under the communication department or under the public relation department, and this staff position is called maybe sustainable development or corporate social responsibility. But it's already good. It's already one step, because the person in this staff position is normally a committed person and is going to try to move things in the right direction. Now a company like, I don't want to make names, but let's say usually company, banking, financial institute, banks, usually they have a very good inside management and responsible management of their own company. However, we forget to look where they are investing. Where are they investing? Are they investing in what are excluded in the exclusion criteria for sustainable investment fund? Are they investing in manufacture of PVC, vinyl chloride? Are they investing in tobacco? Are they investing in manufacture of weapons of all kinds? Are they investing in genetic engineering? Are they investing in nuclear energy, mountaintop removal? All these or are they investing in processes that are reducing the biodiversity? And this is a big question, because if the financial system is continuing to invest in such a product, then we start all to have a huge problem as humankind.
You are involved in companies that probably are seen as very much on the difficult side of this equation with GMO, Syngenta and so on, where you've been very much responsible for trying to introduce new perspectives, but you are also involved in companies that you have created of your own, with your own passion for sustainable business. Could you give us a view on how you see the business imperatives in these things, what it means for business if you are really incorporating sustainable aims in the establishment business, and how you deal with that when you're dealing with an existing large company? How do you try to change the mindset? It's an easy one for you.
It's, of course, not so easy to give you an answer. In fact, I have two kind of lives. One which is dealing with in boards of transnational companies, and I have, of course, an action. On the other side, I'm leading with microeconomy in Brazil, in the poorest region of Brazil. So I have a really interesting position, but it's really a very terre-à-terre position. It's not theoretic. I would like also to tell that it's the first time I'm participating to such a debate. Normally I'm working on the fields, and I don't like to go to appear a lot. Well, I think one of the most important things for an entrepreneur is the long term. The long term, and also creating probably sustainable jobs. This is probably the most important thing. If you look at the role of a company, probably for me, this is one of the most important things. It's exactly what we are trying to do in Brazil. It's also what we're trying to do in other places. And I think that it's a very great challenge. And of course, the environment where we are working is part of the element. And the pressure of the NGOs, which is very important and very serious, and also today with the internet, is very strong. This is always a way to make the people go, and to make the people think better to the real issues of our world. On the other side, as you told, I'm working with organic products in Brazil. I'm working with aquaculture in Brazil. And you can see that we are creating a lot of new jobs in a vision of sustainability. Recently, we have been approached by the Ministry of Fisheries in Brazil to think about the solution, which is definitively a dream, of course, to find a solution to find jobs for 20,000 people, because we have 50,000 people working on dams in the Amazon region, and they want to create jobs for these people at the end of the work. And this is, for us, one of the most fabulous challenges we received. And it's a mission, and we have, of course, all the issues of sustainability, quality of water, of course, the way of breeding fishes differently and without exterminating fishes in the Pacific Ocean and so on. And I think that this was, for us, was really the way of recognizing that we are on the right track. And it's very important to see that the relationship between the government and the small companies, even in Brazil, is very close. They are looking exactly what's happening, and it shows us to think about this kind of project. So I think really creating jobs with a long-term vision, with these barriers of sustainability, which are the triple bottom line, seems for me one of the most important things for responsibility and of the manager.
Susan, George, we're talking about the role of NGOs in being an important player in this. You obviously have a very different view of what corporate responsibility means, and it's been part of your life work to look at this and shine a very, very strong light on what companies are actually doing and not doing. When you hear people talking, as we are here, about corporate responsibilities and looking at different areas of that, what do you see as the main areas of responsibility? Can companies that are operating within a profit-oriented system be responsible? Or
let me begin by telling a story. I participated several years ago in a corporate social responsibility conference in Austria, and I was asked more or less the same question. And I said, I think transnational corporations should start by paying their taxes. All of the statistics of the OECD and others show that their share in their national places of origin are going down compared to what other sectors of society are paying. And we all know the reasons for this: transfer pricing and a lot of front companies in the Cayman Islands and things of that nature. But the man next to me turned to me and said, as he might to a very small and not very bright child, that his job was to help his clients avoid their taxes. That was what he spent his life doing. So I think that a corporation has to recognize that there are police out there that are guarding their property, there are roads to bring their workers there, there is public transport to bring their workers, that there's the fire department, that there are a certain number of services. They're healthy because they've got very often social security, like a good system as we have in France. They are well educated because they've been through the school system. And if you don't contribute to all of that, then you are not, in my view, socially responsible. So I say the same, but please let me make something clear, because in every intervention of this kind that I will make, I want to avoid some confusions that I have run into. One is that absolutely nobody in the alter-globalist movement, or what we prefer to call the social justice movement, is thinking in Cold War terms of capitalism versus socialism. That is totally dead. I think you probably all know that, but I just really want to be extra careful. And, well, because I'm not usually in a milieu of this nature. So, I mean, I want us all to get along, and we will best do that by being as clear as possible. And it's also not about markets versus no markets, because markets can do many things very well. They can help with innovation, they can help in competition and setting prices, and so on. Our debate is on what should be in the market and what shouldn't. And we would say, for example, I think almost all of us would say water should not be in the market. We have to reserve certain goods which are common goods and which must be managed socially, must be managed not only by governments, but also by the representatives of civil society. Brazil has a certain amount of experience with that, as Pierre can probably tell you much better than I can. So, I mean, for instance, my neighbor, should all pharmaceuticals be in the private sector? Electricity, energy in general. I'm saying this is a debate, but it's not one that we have resolved. But it's a question that everyone is asking. Education, yes, there are private institutions, but there should be equally good public ones. That's no longer true, or almost no longer true in the U.S. Or at least at zero cost. I did 2 superior degrees in France, which I would never have been able to do, bringing up 3 small children, and I took a licence and a PhD, and I never could have done that if I had not been in a system which was virtually free, for which we paid taxes, of course. But and when my husband was very ill, He was taken care of admirably for a year and a half before he died by an admirable public health system. So those are the kinds of questions that we are worried about in our movement. And what we see is that it's not just taxes and tax havens, which are a very big issue for us. Tax havens have probably got 12,000 billion in them. That's a conservative estimate, and are used by a lot of thieves, notably in the South. But there's also probably $900 billion a year coming out of the South towards the North in all kinds of transfers, for which, and some of them are the responsibility of transnational corporations that are based in southern countries. Not all of them. A lot of it is just theft by local people, but that's another issue we're worried about. We see that over the last 30 years, there has been a huge trend to privatization of everything, to the point where it almost seems as though the goal of the neoliberal capitalist model is to replace the state completely with the market, not the army and the judiciary, but mostly all of the rest. We see that over the past 30 years in Europe, there has been a transfer of 10 points of GDP from labor to capital. And economists love to discuss this, and it depends what year you start with, and okay, I mean, we can have that argument if you want, but it's roughly a transfer of 10 points of GDP. I think people can agree on that. I've seen many different studies, but it used to be about 70% to labor and about 30 to capital, and now it's about 60 to labor and about 40 to capital. I think the financial sector, but I know that my other neighbor is going to be put on the spot for that, poor man, so I really don't want to start the firing squad. We really do have to get this thing under control, which the G8 and the G20 simply are not doing. Is it responsible to have on commodities markets, food markets? In the year 2003, there was about 13 billion on those markets. In 2008, there was 260 billion. In other words, multiple of 20 times in 5 years. This was like a bidding war. This was not farmers on one side and cookie manufacturers on the other. It was no, it really was speculators who had seen that the subprime market was collapsing and who went flowing into the commodities markets. Just one example, the price of wheat went up by 31% in a single day. And since the US export price is the world price, this meant that people in any number of poor countries were suddenly confronted with their primary staple that cost 2 or 3 times as much. For people who are already spending 60, 70% of their income on food, that is not possible. Okay, we have to get this under control. And it makes me angry when I hear, or when I heard right after the crisis, but nobody saw this coming. That's false. We saw it coming. We talked about this in the Summer University of Attack every year from at least 2003, 2004. Everybody saw it coming who was watching. So I think that this lack of regulation really is a very serious problem, and you cannot just count on self-regulation. That is what the World Business Council for Sustainable Development does. That it is an organization which maybe does some good, it maybe encourages its members to practice sustainable, ecologically responsible business practices. I'm not trying to insult or to indict any individual business. I would like that understood. But as a group, they are against regulation. I've had a discussion with Bjorn Stigson on that subject. No, they're there because their whole line is we can self-regulate. So I think that there's a big danger of going overboard on that. It's certainly been proven in finance, and that's why The Alter Globalization movement wants to tax finance. We want to close down tax havens. I realize that many of our goals are going to seem to you totally utopian, but when we first proposed taxation of financial transactions 10 years ago, everybody laughed at us, and now we have presidents and heads of state who are proposing the same thing. So it takes time. Doing anything progressive takes a very long time. And this distresses me because if you're an industrialist, you ought to be taking the long view, you ought to be investing. They can't always do it because their shareholders are saying, look, I want 15%, I got 10 last year, and this year I'm going to get 15 or more. I mean, these returns were totally unheard of even 15, 20 years ago. But if shareholders have a huge amount of power, and they are getting what they want. And so it's very difficult to be a responsible businessman when you are, I mean, dividends have been multiplied by 3 over, I forget how many years, but very recently they've been, the part, I think they're now up to, yeah, it's 5% of GDP in the U.S., whereas it used to be 2 or something. I don't have those figures in my head, but it really has been a great increase in the share of capital all over, and that's largely due to deregulation and to privatization. I forgot privatization. That's another thing that we have a problem with.
We'll come to that one.
Okay, but it's been about 1.8 trillion there too over the last couple of decades.
I'd like to put that question of the distrust of business to Laura Tyson. The boards of many companies that were criticized, you yourself have been criticized over your role. How are you thinking differently now, if at all, about responsibility because of the financial crisis? How do we go about dealing with that question of the distrust of banks and companies?
Turns on. Well, first of all, I may as well, for those of you who don't know, I am on the board of Morgan Stanley, and I do have a cameo role to play in Inside Job. I think that's what you're referring to. I have not seen Inside Job. I was asked to contribute to Inside Job. I told them that I could not speak on the basis of being a board member, and I take my fiduciary responsibility seriously. I was threatened to be exposed on screen, and I was, so there you go. I have thought about, I like Professor Schwab, have thought about this issue before the financial crisis and after the financial crisis. As the dean of 2 business schools, I was involved very much early on with the students, and I actually want to give students credit here for building courses on corporate social responsibility, for adding ethics to the curriculum, for having there's global social entrepreneurship competitions around the world, business plan competitions. Incidentally, the most successful of those business plan competitions was started with funding from Goldman Sachs. So there have been, I've been proud to be associated with corporate social responsibility, social entrepreneurship, and ethics, and I think it's very important in business schools to think about what to do with that. The global financial crisis has led me many times, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, to ask myself the question, did I behave in an unethical way? I come to the conclusion, but it's a biased conclusion. I'm asking myself the question, and I'm coming up with the answer that I did not. That has forced me to think very hard about the causes. So this is not really about corporate social responsibility. It's about all of the various books and efforts by scholars to try to figure out what happened. And my 2 favorites, and we'll hear from Darrel last so we can hear what his favorites are 2 books by former International Monetary Fund economists. One is called This Time It's Different, and that book actually lays out very clearly histories of financial crises that have occurred periodically in different countries around the world. And you don't need to know the names of people or institutions to understand the crises. They have to do with leverage, they have to do with the price of capital, they have to do with the ability to accumulate excessive debt, and then they have to do with the human tendency when capital is underpriced, when regulation is insufficient, when leverage is too low, to be motivated by greed, it is a basic human motivation, and to go too far, and to destroy themselves and everybody around them in the process. So that's my first favorite book, and my second favorite book is Fault Lines. And if you go into Fault Lines, you'll see 5 causes of the financial crisis. One of the causes is related to the particular incentive structures in financial services institutions. And I do think, I thought that Dr. Schwab's first comment was really telling here about the doctor, except I will add one thing. In the case of the financial services firms, the compensation mechanisms gave you huge upside in creating these deals. And if the deal failed, no downside. So I suppose we'd have to add to the doctor that if it hadn't worked for you, he would have had to go to jail or incur a huge fine. The compensation incentive schemes were, in fact, a part of a system of incentives. There were a whole bunch of others that led to the excessive taking on of risk, and therefore, at the end of the day, risk and leverage, which collapsed on itself. So I do want to say that when I think about the causes of the crisis, corporate social responsibility is a very interesting issue. I would say that each of these firms, each of these players, believed that they were being responsible to their stakeholders. Who were their stakeholders? Who were they? They were their employees. They were their shareholders. There were the analysts who wrote about them. There were the various charities they supported. The financial services institutions are all over the business schools of the world as supporting auditoriums, courses, professors, you name it. They were responsible to a very broad group of stakeholders. And what they thought they were doing was they thought, given the rules of the game, they were competing to be the very best. And it turned out the rules of the game were a vicious race to the bottom. So to be the very best, you had to take on excessive degrees of leverage, excessive degrees of risk, take on product lines which by the nature of an individual firm seem perfectly sensible, but collectively were a great danger to the system. Now, let me conclude by getting back, I didn't know that was a question you were going to ask me, so let me conclude by getting back to the broader discussion here, because I thought the initial conversation by your professor on ethics was really insightful about a fundamental problem. And it also goes to what Dr. Schwab was talking about, global corporate citizenship. Companies are becoming increasingly multinational, increasingly global, and very big relative to government. Governments in many parts of the world are weaker relative to companies. We then say, okay, who's going to write the rules? Who is going to write the rules? Because if the companies write the rules, they will write them in a way which reflects the interests of the companies. That's what they should do. They may represent the interests of the stakeholders in the company, but they will represent the interests of the company. There are collective interests which are broader than the interests of any company, broader than the interests of business. They are collective societal interests. And I agree completely with Susan George. Those interests are actually not being well enough represented by governments right now. But the danger is that governments are weak. They are weak, and in the advanced industrial countries, they are particularly weak. The government representing the best interests of the government right now in dealing with multinationals is the Chinese government. If I think about US multinationals and they're dealing with the US government versus the Chinese government is giving them a much harder time when they want to, because the Chinese government is writing the rules, not the US companies operating in China. So there's this huge issue as we live in this very interdependent world with weaker nation states and failed nation states and semi-failed nation states and very powerful companies. If we leave the rule writing to global corporate citizens, do we get the collective interest? Because I can assure you the global corporate citizens are not going to write that what we should do is have relatively high tax rates for companies. They will not write that rule, Susan. They will basically oppose it every place. And so, and finally I'll just say, because I love that story, how you started it, What's happened, the reason companies go around the world and look for tax breaks is because they can, because governments want them to operate in their countries. They want them to set up employment. They want them to create jobs. They want them to set up educational institutions. They want them to set up research labs. So governments are falling all over one another to give tax breaks to large multinational companies. And it would be it is the job of the multinational company, whether they represent the shareholders narrowly or their stakeholders broadly. Say they represent stakeholders broadly and they're interested in the long-term prosperity of their company. That sounds good, right? That means they should go to the lowest possible tax location to do their work.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to some of those issues soon, but I'm going to bring you in, Darrel, because, well, first of all, you have lots to answer for now, so you can give us your views. What are you seeing from that rewriting of the rules about how you go about regulating corporate and financial whatever interests? Is it successful? Is it possible? Who should do it? How should we do it? And then maybe we can move more broadly into that whole issue with the other speakers about setting rules and who sets them, who agrees.
Okay, I want to get to the rules and the rule writing in a minute. That's still in progress, by the way, and so far it's looking good, but don't take anything for granted. It's going to take years. But I want to step back, and I want, by the way, I don't think I've disagreed with anything that's been said by this wonderful panel. I'm pleased to be part of it. But I want to deal with this background phrase that's in everyone's mind, the evil bankers, and to talk a little bit about the environment in which they are, and picking up some themes also from Laura. Bankers are not grown in a different test tube from a different sort of DNA. They are people in this room. They are all of us. They can become bankers. Some of you probably are. Many of you are students who may become. And you are the product of your environment in many different ways. Now, the ways that are most specifically important here are the social norms and the laws, the infrastructure, those rules, and, of course, incentives, most importantly. And so let's talk about that with respect to the bankers. I used to think when I started teaching at Stanford that I didn't have to talk about ethics and social responsibility in the classroom, that A, it was probably obvious anyway, and B, somebody else was teaching that course. And over time, I disabused myself of that idea. There's hardly a day that goes by in my classroom on financial markets in which I don't confront the students with an ethical issue, and we discuss their responsibility to whom? To their client, to their employees, to society at large, for proper moral and ethical behavior. That's the responsibility of anyone teaching managers. And I take it pretty seriously because I've come to learn that these students will absorb what you say or what their peers in the classroom agree upon, and they will follow those norms when they become bankers or lawyers or doctors. So I think it starts in the classroom, it starts with parents, it starts, as I think Hillary Clinton said, it takes a village. That's our responsibility to do that. Now, going specifically into what's different about bankers, well, they have or companies more generally, they have certain responsibilities as fiduciaries for their shareholders. So, for example, boards of directors of any public company and the management of that company are bound by law to protect the interests of their shareholders. They can be sued for not doing so. So we have to be cautious when we advise them that they have broad responsibilities. We should advise them, but we must be very cautious. So, for example, we have institutions in the United States called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. AIG was a giant disaster. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was an even larger disaster for taxpayers. And how did that happen? It happened because they were given very broad responsibilities to promote home ownership in the United States as a social objective from the government, as well as responsibilities to maximize shareholder value in those corporations. The result was a disaster. They responded to the environment in which they were placed. We must provide a safer and sounder environment, better infrastructure and better rules. I'm going to talk about banks finally specifically. We have a too big to fail problem. It is not cured merely by passing laws. The regulations that implement those laws and the monitoring of those regulations, the infrastructure, matter tremendously. So, for example, we allow banks to run with too little capital and too little liquidity to manage their risks. And they have incentives to take those risks because they are managing the firm on behalf of shareholders, and it's in their incentives to take risks. It's not only the cupidity and avidity which exists in every person. They respond to these incentives. They're wrong. We have to have higher capital requirements and higher liquidity requirements. We actually have tax deductibility of interest on debt, which is strange that we give an incentive to any corporation, and particularly banks, which have so much debt, to use even more debt to finance themselves, to get even more leverage, as Laura was saying. We need to repeal that tax incentive to run at too much risk. We have all kinds of problems that are being partially addressed in Europe and in the United States by regulations. For example, the derivatives markets were far too opaque, too dark. We couldn't see what was going on there, and all kinds of bad things were going on, and there were sources of risk there that were out of control. And AIG was one of the worst abusers of those derivatives markets and taking undue amounts of risk. How do we change the infrastructure? That's the responsibility of government and regulators. The government has been starving regulators of resources, particularly in the United States. The Securities and Exchange Commission cannot implement the laws that it's been asked to implement because it hasn't been given the resources by Congress to do that, because there's a disagreement in Congress between the two parties over how much resources the government needs to use to control risk-taking in the financial sector. That situation needs to be cured. So I have a lot of additional things that I would like to say. However, I would say that we need to take, all of us, the responsibility of placing managers and boards of directors in an environment where their incentives are more closely aligned with those of society. So we need to change our laws and rules to change compensation practices so that it doesn't need to be a source of stress for a manager to choose between harming society, to pollute society with systemic risk, or to serve the interests of shareholders. Those should be one and the same thing, provided the manager is observing the laws and regulations and is responding to the incentives that are placed in front of that manager. And again, I don't think bankers are different human beings at their base level than any other.
Let me just turn to you, Professor Schwab. You must have been sitting there listening. I see you writing notes. You were talking in your levels of social responsibility, of corporate responsibility, about the highest level aligning or bringing together the issues of government, society, and business. And this is basically what Darrel at the end was saying, is that we need to get those incentives aligned. Can we do that by discussion and self-regulation? Do we need to change the way in which the framework, and particularly when we're talking about a global scenario, we don't have a global government. So how do we best ensure that those incentives are aligned?
Definitively, it needs cooperation. There cannot be, we have certain issues which can be solved by self-regulation, but most of the issues need regulation, and they need global regulation. And even if I look at finance, if I go back to, let's say, the spirit of the G20 in Pittsburgh, London, and so on, you were partially involved. I think regulations have come out, but the only global regulation is probably Basel III. And the rest is piecemeal work, patchwork of governments. So how do we create regulations in a global world? That's the issue. And then we come, of course, everybody, the mind comes to the G20. The G20, I think, did a great job to prevent the free fall of the world. But now to deal with those more forward-looking issues is practically impossible, because I don't want to go now into governance issues, because every country, let me just say one sentence, has different priorities at this moment. And I would say the whole thing is more complicated, because you spoke, Professor Duffie, about systemic risks. But if we look, we have not only systemic risks in the business and banking system, we have systemic risks in the global economic system, with too much saving, you would probably say, flowing to countries, accumulating debts in order to finance consume. So it's a very difficult world, and it should start. I mean, business has globalized. It should start with a global dialogue. I think today also it needs a cooperation of business and governments and civil society, I would add, because the issues are too complex. I was participating on Tuesday at a conference called by President Sarkozy, and you had all the big shots of the internet industry, like Eric Schmidt and so on, to discuss regulation in the internet industry. Government lacks the knowledge, really, to deal with those issues. So what we need is to go, and maybe I'm dreaming into an area of co-design. It's not only dialogue, it's co-design, where the three pillars of society should be involved. Because we need the best knowledge, but we need also global regulations. Just have one point. If you look today at the competitiveness of countries, it's very interesting. The most competitive countries in Europe are those who are best regulated and have the best social system. We speak about Scandinavia, we speak about Germany, all with a growth rate of 5% and with a record of employment, which means a low of unemployment. So it shows regulation and social responsibility, social inclusion pays out in terms of dollars, in terms of kronas or whatever. It's profitable.
Pierre, can I just bring you in on that? You have what is different in looking at return on investments and so on when you are basing it on an idea that is beyond just profit?
Well, my experience, of course, with very small companies that are created, and there is no doubt that the return on investment is much hard to obtain than in a common and a simple company. You have to create and train the people. You have to create new paradigms for the industry when you are a pioneer in some areas where I am. And this, of course, can't be, and it's going back to the vision of long term, this can't be tackled by quarterly reports. This can't be seen as a quick return of investment, and this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have working with the sustainable activities.
It was mentioned that there were good and bad sides of the stories we're talking about corporate responsibility. And I teach a class on emerging markets, and we always do a section on interesting, successful stories of either large or small companies that have explored opportunities and defined models to deal with the poorest consumers in developing markets. I suspect you're doing some of that. And I think it's really important that actually some very large companies are doing this. And it isn't the case. Somehow or other, this notion that they're constrained by their quarterly returns or their shareholder demands is that's an assumption which turns out not to be entirely true. I think about the very famous, well-reported discussion of Unilever in India and the Shakti experience, which you can say that is a completely profit-motivated investment. It is an investment which has taken a long time to pay off. It has developed a set of jobs and institutions and links to the poorest communities in India that would not exist if Unilever had not done this. It shows up as a broad stakeholder activity, but actually it was motivated initially by profitability and shareholders, but shareholders willing to take a long-term perspective in building something. That's not the only example. There's a wonderful example of the M-Pesa mobile money, which now something like 85% of all consumers in Kenya use. That came out of, I'm particularly proud of this, a student from London Business School who went into the corporate social responsibility section of Vodafone. He came up with this idea. In Vodafone, you were allowed to pitch ideas, and as long as they hit a certain hurdle rate, you could go forward with the proposal. This has turned out to be extremely dramatically successful in Kenya in terms of development. It's been very successful for Vodafone and very successful for the state-owned, for the telecom company of Kenya. So I just want to say that since a lot of this is negative right now, I just wanted to put into this, because I suspect the story is the same from the gentleman on my left, that large companies can and do, maybe not as much as they should, these kinds of activities. And some of the big, and I believe, I certainly know that Nestle does lots of these things. There are lots of companies that do, and it's important to get that out there. Why do they do it is an interesting question, and maybe I'd ask Darrel, part of it is getting managers to ask themselves the questions, what can we do in these kinds of markets? It may be tough, it may be, the return may be a little slower, it may be a little lower at the beginning, but you have to ask the question. And visionary managers can lead the companies by asking the question.
And how do you get managers to ask that question within a framework where they are under pressure? Because we work with a lot of companies, I was saying, that are going into Africa at the moment. They're under a lot of pressure to find ways to meet key performance indicators. How can we deal with that? As long as companies have a short-term view, it's very, very difficult to make this work.
I would say in this area, this is where we want to let creative and visionary people go and take risks and invest for the long run and not interfere. I mean, we ourselves can talk about it. I don't think we're going to be able to find and put in the right places those visionary creative people. They're going to do that on their own. Where we can make a difference is where those incentives are not aligned with social responsibility. My friend Ilya Feldstein and I were talking over breakfast this morning, not this morning, earlier this week, and I think we agreed that in most cases, not all, the incentives for social responsibility are well aligned with the stakeholders of a firm. It's those cases where they're not, like air pollution or financial systemic risk. We do not let the managers have their way there. As Laura was saying, we need hard governments. We need governments with smart, strong institutions. Singapore, and not to praise all aspects of its government, pays its government managers the same salaries that are paid to the comparable private sector managers. We don't need to hire larger governments. We need to hire better governments to correct what economists call externalities, situations in which the incentives are not aligned.
I think these are excellent examples, but I would also like to remind us that a lot of money is spent on lobbying so that these things do not really take place. The financial industry spent $5 billion on getting rid of about 12 regulations, and that was peanuts for them. That was nothing. $5 billion for this industry is nothing. And they got rid of Glass-Steagall. The two most important ones were getting rid of Glass-Steagall. And you say we have a too-big-to-fail problem, but why do we have a too-big-to-fail problem? Because Glass-Steagall was abolished, and everybody was very happy about this, including President Clinton, Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and tutti quanti. And this means that now, then there was the huge wave of mergers, and they did it on purpose. I mean, that's what they wanted. It's excellent to know that if you happen to take too many risks, that someone else will come in and clean up the mess. And it used to be that governments were, I mean, kings were the ones that ruined the corporations because they ruined the banks. They borrowed and then they fought and then they lost and they didn't pay them back, and that a lot of bank failures. Now it's the other way around. It's the banks that are really running the show, and so in Europe we don't even have a register. You don't even have to sign in to say I am lobbying and I'm spending so much for client X, Y, or Z. You don't even have to do that. So, and they're also the ones who got rid of the regulations in the derivatives on the commodities markets, the commodities Futures Modernization Act. Every time they want to deregulate, they call it reform or modernization. But they've been very successful, and they've got exactly what they want. Whether the rest of us have got exactly what we want is a different issue. I think we certainly have not, and now the people are having to pay twice. We paid first for the TARP and all of the bailouts in Europe. Two researchers at the Bank of England say that between the payments up front and the guarantees, it comes to $14 trillion that is not coming out of the sky, but out of our pockets. And no, I think this is completely unfair, and I think that, unfortunately, the way that they seem to be going forward on the crisis in Europe is absolutely the wrong way to do it. It gives me the impression that we're in 1931 and we're under Herbert Hoover. It's as if John Maynard Keynes had never existed. I mean, it's really criminal, and these people have the power to impose these situations on us. So, I mean, it's not just, it's not all sweetness and light, although I am all for these very good examples.
And it's well known in the U.S. that there was a very brave woman who tried to stand up to Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers, suggesting that, in fact, it was important to do things like regulate credit default swaps, but her voice did not carry the day. I will say this. I think that was a combination of effective lobbying, but I think there's something else here. And it was said most starkly by Alan Greenspan himself before Congress, I think in 2008. He has since backtracked a little bit. But what he said was his intellectual construct was wrong. And this was a construct that had a heyday in the United States right around the turn of the century, and this was that markets, smart people could regulate themselves. In fact, they would understand better than these terribly underpaid regulators, who are not the first quality people because they're underpaid. They will understand better than underpaid regulators the right thing to do. And since it's not in their collective interest to do the wrong thing, they will do the right thing. The failure of that logic is just apparent in the word collective. Everyone did what was the right thing in their individual interest and was absolutely the wrong thing collectively. There was no collective voice. That's what self-regulation means. There's no collective voice. So I don't think it was just lobbying. I do worry about lobbying, and I guess I would ask Darrel what he thinks about it. One of the things we did in the United States in the last year, I guess a year, maybe two, the Supreme Court basically made a decision that free speech means companies can spend any amount of money they want to influence political outcomes. There is no limit. That is a Supreme Court decision of the United States.
I think we are missing one important point in our discussion. We just come out of the financial crisis. We will move into another crisis, and we see already the first signs, and it's a job crisis. A job crisis. And the only person, and the only person who has mentioned it until now were you, Mr. Landolt. And we will measure not the responsibility of individual companies, but of the industrial system as a whole in terms of its capability to create jobs. If you have a situation like in Spain now, and you see the first signs, I said in an interview in our local television that we may have a second 68, because one day the young people will rebel against our generation by not fulfilling their expectations. And I think the expectations is particularly jobs. If you look, I mentioned Spain, but I had this morning an Egyptian delegation in my office, and the minister explained to me, people speak always about democracy and so on, that's certainly a key issue, but the result or the success of our revolution will depend on the capability of create fast jobs. So one part of the social responsibility of companies is to create jobs. And I just wanted to make this issue because I see here a big crisis coming up. I just want to illustrate what I'm saying. I read today, and Laura, you may confirm, we are back in the United States to the level of GDP compared to before the crisis, but with 3 or 4 million or 6 million, I don't recall, less, 7 million less jobs. So this shows the dimension of the crisis. In three years, 7 million jobs have been lost.
The council that I am a member of is, President Obama has established a council, and the council is called Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. It is almost entirely consists of CEOs of companies. An academic is a very rare, I mean, I'm honored to be there, but I'm not creating any jobs. I'm helping to create educated individuals who can get jobs by business education, but I'm not creating any jobs per se. I think it's really interesting. This group is actually, and again, it goes to the point of you first have to ask the question. So these CEOs are now asking the question. It's one of the questions they ask themselves when they sort of say, how can I create shareholder value? How can I compete with the firm down the street? How can I increase my share of global markets? Those are all standard questions that heads of companies, big multinational companies, ask themselves. But these people really are saying, how can I, or how can my industry actually create jobs? And I want to say that they're coming up with sort of target numbers and game plans, and just asking the question leads to the following kinds of possible answers. Gee, should I consider onshoring some of the jobs that I've offshored? Are there people in some parts of the United States who could do these jobs as well? A second question, can I work more closely with community colleges to take a very specific area where I know I'm going to need a certain kind of skill and encourage students who are in these colleges, community colleges, to take that course of training, and I will help design that course of training. So those are just two examples of rather practical things, and I would say it really starts with you ask yourself the question. On your list of things you wake up and think about every day as a CEO, if you say, one of the things I think about is how could I expand my U.S. employment? And I think that that's will possibly have some beneficial effects. It's certainly coming up with some interesting put into practice ideas that, that I think will be put into practice.
Although it also raises the question, what happens to those jobs that they are re-onshoring from the offshoring, which your Egyptians no doubt were worried about.
One of the things we have absolutely completely not addressed here in this really is that multinational companies, even the largest, certainly the largest U.S. multinational companies, are still disproportionately U.S. companies. That is, they still have most of their employment in the United States, most of their production in the United States, most of their investment in the United States, but that's breaking down. It is breaking down. Countries around the world are competing for these jobs, competing for this investment, and you do have to say, who are the stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders? Are the employees in India the stakeholders, the same as the stakeholders as the employees in Silicon Valley? Is the government of a state in India a equally valid stakeholder to the governor of California? Those are huge issues for multinational companies.
That's right. And if
I'm sorry, but we have a structural problem here, because you're absolutely right to talk about unemployment. But what does that mean? It means that demand is falling. It means that the economy is therefore not turning over as it was. That means that there's no collusion, there's no intentionality, they're not trying to be deliberately harmful. But what the corporations are doing is using employment as the variable. They react to the falling demand by saying, okay, we'll have to get rid of some employees, or we'll have to pay less, or we'll have to. That is the variable. So it's structural, and we're doing the same thing in Europe. I mean, look, Ireland multiplied by 3. Greece multiplied by who knows how much. I mean, everywhere it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So, but it's structural. The good examples exist. I'm delighted to hear good examples, but this doesn't take care of the structural problem of falling demand, because we're not doing what Roosevelt did, which was to create a whole alphabet soup of employment-creating agencies. We're paying the banks, we're giving TARPs, but we're not making Tennessee Valley authorities or works progress administrations or that sort of thing. Yeah. Their problem is to create jobs. And Juan Somavia, who is the head of the International Labor Organization, says he hears all the time, just create any jobs. We'll talk about decent work later. But you have to talk about decent work now also, or it doesn't generally happen later. I haven't an answer to that. All I can tell you is that in Europe, and probably the US, but certainly in Europe, 90% of all the jobs are created by small and medium enterprise, not by very large corporations.
I was last week in China and discussed the new 5-year plans, and the whole plan is built on social and environmental sustainability. So we should not, let's say, have this old picture of the developing world, looking at them, they are developing. In many ways, they are advancing, even in their thinking related to us. Just imagine, China is the biggest investor today in alternative energies. So the world is rapidly changing, not only as far as production is concerned, but even as far as the philosophy and the approach to those issues is concerned.
So from the consumer side, Paola.
Yes, I'm strongly believing in what you are saying. I think that consumers, we are all human beings, and so we are all consumers. And we can really vote with our wallet and with our money, and we can make our voice heard. I must say I'm very enthusiastic about what is happening also in the world. I'm meaning all the social movement, because we are saying government should regulate or multinationals are self-regulating themselves, I think that the social movement are going to oblige us to regulate ourselves. Yes, I strongly believe in that, and the social media is so important also for the younger generation, and I think they are thinking in another way, in a less structured way that we are thinking, but they are really moving things in the right direction. When I'm thinking about the people demonstrating against nuclear plant, power plant, and how they can really get together through the social media and occupy places, or just because they are jobless in Spain. But not only the jobless young people are creating this kind of movement. And I think I strongly believe that if we don't regulate the world, the global world, through governments and through multinational companies, I'm sure that these social movements are going peacefully to regulate what we should do. And example is they don't want to participate to weapon manufacturing. They don't want to participate to conflict. It's a new generation, and I think we are going to see many things happening in the next years.
It's a lack of imagination, research, and it's exactly for that reason that the Brazilian government went to a very tiny company to ask us to find a solution. And I think that's also a way to recognize that they are not able to create jobs. They need really the enterprises, their idea, their vision. They are, of course, choosing one of the most interesting, which probably are more sustainable than the others. But it's a real challenge, and I think that this dialogue between authorities and those companies is very important, and is able to bring and to create jobs.
We need to distinguish at this point different reasons for the job problem. And actually, I think Susan is correct to point out that in the advanced industrial countries and the European region, Spain I would certainly include here, this is because we've just gone through a devastating financial crisis which has really knocked out the amount of demand. So if you're right, companies think of it as I want to produce a good or service to sell, and I will employ people to do that. But if the market has contracted or disappeared, you're not going to be able to do that. Or if you cannot get access to credit, because there's another whole thing that's going on here. For the small and medium-sized business engine of job creation, the capital market for a significant amount of time just closed down. There wasn't any capital to do that. So they're lacking demand and they're lacking capital. The problem in Egypt, and I don't understand it completely, but this was an economy which even during a relative boom time had a huge youth bulge and was not creating jobs. So you have to look at its tax structure, you have to look at its capital market structure, you have to look at its policies towards foreign direct investment, its trading policies. It is not created a hospitable environment, even in a good economy, to generate jobs. That's a different kind of problem. And then finally, I mean, the country that has been the best at massive job mobilization in the last 20 years has in fact been China. And you have to say that a lot of that was done through state investment, oftentimes at the level of the town or the city, Shanghai itself, the government itself. Now, Shanghai created its own car industry. Shanghai was basically, we're going to create a car industry because we need to employ people in Shanghai. And they had access to capital, and they had access to a growing market and the right tax. They had very low taxes, very low cost of energy, very low cost of land. It was an entrepreneurs, and some of these were state entrepreneurs, paradise. and they create massive amounts of jobs.
The way to create jobs today, or at least one way, is to have a massive conversion to a green economy. In other words, to change the industrial model altogether, to change the farming model altogether, convert to organic agriculture, which is very labor intensive and much healthier. Of course, agribusiness doesn't want this. And a Green New Deal is what is needed. But unfortunately, only the state or even a larger entity like Europe is able to undertake that. And now a lot of people in the business world are investing in a green conversion. They are doing what the state ought to do, but they've invested so far about 1.8 trillion, according to the sources I've read, which is great because that is the new locus of job creation. It's recycling, it's all kinds of, but you have to change the model and you have to invest in clean tech and clean energy.
We should recognize that job creation takes mainly place in the small and newly created companies and not in the big multinationals. And job creation is based on entrepreneurship. Now, we could look what are the key factors. Education is certainly one of those. But it was very interesting when I mentioned I was at this preparatory conference for the G8 on the internet. There was a question which was posed to one of the big, I don't want to mention the names, but everybody would know him. And the question was, why are all those companies created in Silicon Valley and not in Europe? Mm-hmm. And why is it so difficult? I mean, you come from Stanford. Why is it so difficult to create Silicon Valleys somewhere else, maybe in China, but not in Europe? And the answer was because when you fail in Europe as an entrepreneur, you are stigmatized for all your life. When you fail in the States as an entrepreneur who has taken risks, you are in some way knighthooded because you have shown that you take risks and you take a second one, and maybe the third or fourth will succeed. So my message to you, to the young people, would be take risks. That's the only way how you can
get
create
some capital
jobs.
and risk it.
Yeah.
But don't do it in Europe. Paola.
Oh, I liked very much what said Suzanne. I agree with her. We need to change the model, and probably the clean tech and green model is a model to go, and it will create new jobs, non-existing jobs. I would like to add that I strongly believe also in decentralized system for food supply, for instance, proximity, organic agriculture, of course, and so it can create a kind of autonomy for the communities. And this is creating jobs. Also concerning energy, energies that can be decentralized, creating job by generating or creating energy in community so that you can go for more autonomous energy power supply.
Laura, you must have a thought on growth.
I think, I'm sorry if we didn't mention the word. I think it is very important. I think it was behind a lot of what was said because, first of all, we have gone through a period of actually negative growth in the advanced industrial countries. We are slowly coming into positive growth. But I do want to say that, you know, the advanced industrial countries, including the United States, and the United States may end up being a relatively high growth country in advanced industrial countries, but the growth rates in these countries are they're in the 2 to 3% range at best. That's in a good time. Well, the two drivers of growth over the long term are the rate of growth of the labor force and the rate of growth of productivity. And in many countries in Europe, the labor force is declining, or certainly growing at about 0. And so if you get productivity growth rate of 2% a year, which is quite high for a developed country, you end up at 2%. I mean, it's just the arithmetic. I can't do anything about the arithmetic. Whereas a country like China growing at 10% for 30 years, that's really why they were able to create all of those jobs. So I do think, we didn't mention the word, but without growth is very much a major factor in terms of the growth of demand, and therefore the ability of businesses to have opportunities to produce and employ.